Hello again, my friend. I'm glad you found your way back tonight. Let the day loosen its grip for a while. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet, into medieval Iberia, into rooms that history mostly forgot to describe, where women waited, worked, and endured beneath a very different sky than ours. Somewhere in Castile, in December of 1485, a woman is screaming, and no one outside the room is allowed to know how bad it sounds. Beyond the walls, a war hasn't paused for her. Messengers are still riding. Soldiers are still camped somewhere near Granada. And in this one room, a queen is fighting through the most dangerous hours of her life, while the machinery of a kingdom keeps turning without her. She is not a private patient tucked away from politics. She is the politics. Her pain has dynastic weight. Her body, right now, is deciding something about the future that no treaty could decide on its own. By morning, there will be a daughter, and one day, everyone in Europe will know this child's name. But tonight, in this room, nobody knows what she'll become. Nobody even knows yet if she'll survive till morning. Before we go further, dim the lights if you can. Pull a blanket around your shoulders. If a fan or a soft hum helps you settle, turn it on now. Let your head rest somewhere supported. You don't need to be anywhere else for the next little while. If slow history like this helps you rest, a like and a subscribe helps this little corner of the internet find its way back to you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I read every comment. I like picturing this story landing in so many different rooms at so many different hours. Her name was Isabella of Castile. She was born on 22 April 1451 in a town called Madrigal de las Altas Torres, the daughter of King John II of Castile and his second wife, Isabella of Portugal. Nobody in that room could have known she'd become the woman later generations would build into a legend. She was just a royal infant, born into a family that was powerful but far from peaceful. A childhood shaped by succession disputes, court factions, marriage politics, and the uneasy rule of her half-brother, Henry IV. It's worth pausing on the word childhood, because it can trick us into imagining something soft and sheltered. A princess could be dressed richly, educated properly, surrounded by attendants, and still be shuffled from residence to residence, watched constantly, raised to understand that her body belonged to her lineage before it belonged to her. Elite households in medieval Iberia were part home, part institution, arranged around rank and ceremony as much as comfort. A girl learned early that food, prayer, marriage, pregnancy, and illness were never simply private when a bloodline was standing behind them. And Iberia itself was not one thing. It was Christian kingdoms, Muslim polities, Jewish communities, and countless lives crossing between them through trade, migration, and family. There was no single country called Spain, yet Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, and Granada each had their own rulers, laws, and languages. So when we say medieval Spanish homes, we're already flattening something that was never flat. A household in Toledo didn't look like one in Barcelona or Cordoba or a frontier village near the Granadan border. But across all that difference, one thing tended to hold. Childbirth stayed inside the home. Physicians existed. Medical texts existed. But labor itself usually belonged to a household, a neighborhood, a network of women. And here's something I want to be upfront about. The women who actually did this work left far fewer records than the men who wrote about them. What survives comes in fragments: medical treatises, legal cases, household accounts, scattered mentions of midwives. We can't rebuild every room. We can't hear every voice. In the Islamic territories of Al-Andalus, a professional midwife was often called a kabila, a word tied to the act of receiving a newborn. Researchers draw a line between her and the experienced older relatives or neighbors who might help without holding any formal title. That distinction isn't about who cared more. It's about how medieval communities organized different kinds of knowledge, payment, and legal accountability. A trained kabila might be summoned outside her own family, paid for her work, and called to testify in court about a birth or a death. In Castilian, the word was partera. It tells you the shape of the job without telling you much about the woman doing it. A partera might have trained through years of apprenticeship, or she might simply be someone whose competence came from decades of watching, helping, repeating. Knowledge like this rarely lives in books. It moves hand to hand, memory to memory, which matters enormously for childbirth, because childbirth is urgent, physical, and almost impossible to write down while it's happening. Picture learning a profession by standing just behind an older woman, watching how she listens, how she positions her hands, how she catches a change in someone's breathing before anyone else notices it. The sources from Al-Andalus describe exactly that kind of training, oral, generational, built on years beside a mentor. A student might assist, prepare materials, hold and steady the mother, and slowly learn to tell the difference between ordinary difficulty and real danger. This wasn't one woman alone in a dark room facing her fate. It was a small working team, gathered close because the stakes demanded closeness. Isabella, being royal, had a much bigger version of that team around her: ladies, servants, clerks, chaplains, physicians, messengers. A royal birth had consequences that reached far past the mother's bed, but status never bought immunity. A queen could command resources. She could not command her own body to cooperate. In October 1469, Isabella married Ferdinand of Aragon at the palace of Juan de Vivero in Valladolid. History remembers this as a political masterstroke, and it was, but it was also two people whose future would be built from war, travel, negotiation, worship, pregnancy, and grief. Their partnership would later be remembered as the foundation of Spanish monarchy. The domestic labor that kept that foundation standing tends to disappear beneath the titles. A royal marriage was expected to produce children, and that expectation wasn't sentimental, it was structural. Children meant succession, alliance, and the possibility of peace between rival factions. A son could be raised as a future king. A daughter could carry an alliance into another court. Every single pregnancy could shift the balance of power. And underneath all of that political math was a woman experiencing nausea, exhaustion, pain, bleeding, recovery, and the very real possibility of dying. We shouldn't mistake the limits of medieval medicine for indifference. They had no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no surgical obstetrics, but they had generations of accumulated experience, trained practitioners, remedies, prayers, and legal frameworks around birth. Studies of Andalusian midwifery describe professional training, structured domestic care, and formal legal responsibilities, while regional medical writings treated pregnancy, the fetus, and the newborn as subjects worth serious, sustained attention. Medical knowledge moved through texts written in Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and the local vernaculars, and through the people who translated, copied, and adapted that knowledge as they carried it. A 10th century work connected to Ibn Sa'd addressed fetal development, pregnancy, and newborns. The writings of Abulcasis and Averroes shaped the wider medical culture of the region. None of this turned every household into a clinic. But it tells us childbirth wasn't happening in an intellectual vacuum. It sat inside living traditions of study and debate. At home, management of a birth could mean preparing a room, gathering experienced women, offering physical support during labor, tending the newborn, and layering in whatever religious or protective practice fit the family's faith. A Muslim household, a Jewish household, and a Christian household might reach for different prayers and different laws, but they shared the same practical truth underneath. Women needed help from other women. Birth spaces were often segregated by gender, partly for modesty, partly because women's health care was, quite simply, handled among women. Here's a hard truth worth sitting with. Home did not mean safe. Home meant familiar. It meant available, socially organized, prepared as well as circumstances allowed. But a serious complication could still outrun everything the household knew how to do. So historians try to avoid both extremes, the old fantasy that medieval birth was pure ignorance and panic, and the opposite fantasy that midwives were secretly holding modern medical knowledge. The truth sits in between: skill, limitation, improvisation, trust, and risk, all tangled together. When Isabella's children started arriving, none of it happened quietly. Her daughter Isabella was born in the 1470s, her son Juan in 1478, her daughter Joanna on 6 November 1479, Maria in 1482, and Catherine in December 1485. Each birth added a person to the family, and each one also shifted the political imagination surrounding the throne. A son's birth carried a particular kind of relief, since male inheritance was usually favored, though daughters could and did inherit in the right circumstances. A daughter's birth carried its own kind of value, since marriage alliances stitched courts and territories together across Europe. Before any of these children became names in diplomatic letters, they were infants who needed warmth, feeding, and someone awake beside them through the night. What must it feel like to know the child you're carrying is loved as a baby and simultaneously watched as a possible treaty, heir, or bride? There's no simple answer. Isabella's own life proved exactly how complicated it was, a woman who endured pregnancy after pregnancy while also being a monarch who had to calculate, coldly, what each pregnancy meant for her kingdom. Her body was where hope and pain lived. It was also, uncomfortably, one of the places where the future of Castile and Aragon was being negotiated. To really understand how women managed childbirth in Iberian homes, you have to stop picturing the household as scenery, a passive backdrop where a birth just happens to occur. It wasn't. A house was a place of knowledge, storage, labor, and judgment. Women there knew which neighbor had helped through a hard delivery, which relative had borne many children safely, which practitioner people trusted, which prayers belonged to which tradition, and which signs meant ordinary labor had turned into something dangerous. There might be a specific room chosen for warmth or privacy, though the evidence doesn't let us pin down one universal layout. Wealth mattered, climate mattered, religion and local architecture mattered. In one home, birth might happen near a hearth; in another, tucked into a more secluded corner; in an elite household, surrounded by attendants whose work we can only trace through payments and supply lists. The people gathered in that room formed a temporary community: a midwife, an assistant, an older relative, a friend, a servant, sometimes several women at once. They're out of both affection and practical necessity. A midwife's job didn't start and end at the moment of delivery. She might advise throughout the pregnancy, assess the mother's condition, interpret symptoms, prepare for labor, and stay involved for days afterward. In Islamic legal contexts, the Qabila's responsibilities could stretch into the courtroom too. Her testimony mattered, because birth touched questions of inheritance, legitimacy, and disputes over a child's death. That legal visibility matters because it complicates a familiar story, the idea that women's medical knowledge was entirely private and unofficial. Some care was domestic, yes, but domestic didn't always mean invisible. A respected midwife could be known across an entire neighborhood, hired by multiple families, summoned for difficult deliveries, and trusted by legal authorities as a credible witness. Her expertise was embodied, learned through repetition rather than a university seat, and it was still publicly consequential. In Al-Andalus, researchers identify both professional midwives and volunteer helpers, often relatives or neighbors, a flexible system rather than a rigid hierarchy. If a trained Qabila was available, she might lead, with assistants supporting the mother physically. If not, experienced women simply gathered anyway. The household held room for both specialized and communal care. The written medical tradition, meanwhile, ran in parallel. Texts tied to Ibn Sa'd discussed fetal development and newborn care. Abulcasis wrote within a surgical tradition attentive to instruments and physical intervention. Averroes worked in a learned world where Greek, Arabic, and Latin medicine converged. None of this meant a laboring woman was following a textbook step by step. It meant childbirth existed inside a much wider world of thought than we often give the medieval period credit for. Can you feel how far that is from the tired old picture, an ignorant past where every birth was pure chance? The evidence won't support that picture. It also won't support the opposite one, where every household had a reliable answer to every danger. Real historical care sits in the middle, observant, skilled, and limited, all at once. A midwife might recognize a dangerous presentation without having any modern surgical way to fix it. A family might prepare with real care and still lose the fight. A prayer could comfort a mother, while a physical intervention worked on her body in an entirely different register, and medieval people rarely experienced those two things as opposites. At court, the scale simply expanded. Isabella's pregnancies meant travel between residences, constant communication with Ferdinand, and close attention from anyone concerned with succession. Her household was not a hospital, and we can't always recover exactly who attended each birth. It's tempting to invent a name for the midwife who helped her. A story feels warmer with one. But the honest answer is that the sources preserve the Queen's child, the date, and the political backdrop, while the women who did the hands-on work stayed unnamed. That silence isn't proof no skilled woman was there. It's proof the record was never built to remember her. A chronicle celebrates the newborn. A diplomat logs the succession. A royal account tracks expenses. And the woman holding the mother's hand stays a shadow at the edge of the page. Much of women's history starts exactly there, not by inventing a hidden biography, but by asking what labor must have existed for the documented event to have happened at all. Isabella's pregnancies moved to the rhythm of monarchy, but monarchy, in turn, moved to the rhythm of her body. She bore daughters and a son, lived through the ordinary uncertainty of 15th-century pregnancy, and still kept traveling, negotiating, hearing petitions, and attending ceremonies. A queen could be visibly pregnant and politically visible at the same time, even with periods of seclusion built around each birth. Her son Juan, born in 1478, mattered enormously as a male heir. Joanna arrived on 6 November 1479, the same year Ferdinand inherited the crown of Aragon after his father's death, tightening the dynastic bond historians now call the union of two crowns. Maria followed in 1482 and Catherine in December 1485. These children entered a household whose political horizon was widening by the year. But they also entered the fragile early stretch of infancy, where feeding, warmth, infection, and their mother's own recovery would decide whether any of that widening horizon meant anything at all. There's a quiet irony buried in the records. Medieval sources obsess over lineage and almost entirely ignore the daily labor that kept lineage alive. They note who was born, who married, who died, and the small repeated acts around a newborn vanish. Someone warmed the cloth. Someone watched the bleeding. Someone carried water. Someone noticed the baby's breath was too shallow, or that the mother couldn't stand, or that the milk hadn't come. This work was ordinary, and ordinary work is usually the first thing a historical record forgets. The same erasure happens to midwives themselves. Their labor could be essential without making them famous. Andalusian sources describe their functions spanning education, healthcare, and legal testimony, but most individual identities simply weren't preserved. A woman could be the most trusted expert in her neighborhood's most intimate moments and remain, to us, a complete stranger. Her name might survive only in a trial record or a scrap of an account book. So managing childbirth needs to be understood broadly. It meant deciding who to call, preparing a room, gathering help, offering physical support, watching mother and child, weaving in prayer or ritual, making hard calls when labor didn't go the way it was supposed to. At court, it also meant the political choreography, the messages announcing a birth, the ceremonies that made it public, the negotiations that followed. A single birth could ripple through several rooms at once. In the chamber, women worked. In nearby rooms, servants waited and officials drafted announcements. In a chapel, someone prayed. Beyond the household walls, messengers were already carrying the news outward. The event was intensely domestic at its center and thoroughly public at its edges. Here's a correction worth making, because the popular version of this story is too neat. It isn't true that medieval women were simply left to midwives while physicians stayed absent, and it isn't true that physicians later swept in to replace an entirely female tradition. The real picture is far more tangled. Physicians, surgeons, midwives, relatives, wet nurses, confessors, and legal authorities all occupied overlapping ground, the balance shifting by place, religion, class, and circumstance. Midwives carried practical expertise. Physicians carried learned authority. Families reached for whichever combination they trusted and could get. That correction matters for Isabella specifically. A royal household could draw on formal medical learning without the midwife ever becoming irrelevant. A physician's presence didn't erase the need for a woman who understood labor from lived, hands-on experience. If you were the one responsible for a birth, and you had access to written medical advice, inherited custom, religious hope, and the judgment of one experienced woman standing right beside you, which would you lean on? Probably trust more than any single source. A practitioner who'd already helped a sister, a cousin, or a neighbor through labor carried a kind of evidence money couldn't buy. She'd been tested by memory. A calm hand, a good eye for danger, a habit of treating the mother with dignity. That reputation was the medical credential, no university required. For a royal woman, though, trust got complicated fast because everyone was watching. A pregnancy could be monitored because it might produce an heir, might shift a diplomatic deal, might tip the balance of power at court. The private terror of labor and a very public audience waiting outside the door, somehow, both had to exist in the same room at once. And still, the body doesn't care about ceremony. Labor doesn't get tidier because the woman screaming is a queen. The room might be lined in silk and silver, heraldic banners on the walls, but pain is pain, and fear is fear. Isabella's later legend can make her feel larger than life. Childbirth pulled her right back down into same vulnerable, physical condition every other woman in Iberia knew, whatever extra resources surrounded her. In December 1485, Isabella gave birth to her youngest daughter, the girl who would grow up to be Catherine of Aragon. Modern accounts split on the exact date, with both 15 and 16 December in circulation, so it's safer to hold onto the month rather than force a precision the sources can't support. What we do know for certain is the larger picture. Isabella and Ferdinand were in the middle of the Granada campaign, and this child arrived into a household whose attention was split between a battlefield and a birth chamber. Which brings us back to where we started. A queen in labor, a war outside the walls. That opening scene wasn't invented for drama. It came from the plain fact that royal childbirth and royal warfare shared the same calendar. We won't put invented words in Isabella's mouth or describe a chamber the sources never bothered to sketch. But we can sit with the pressure of the coincidence itself. A household caring for a mother and newborn, while also holding up the entire machinery of a kingdom at war. Catherine's birth didn't announce the extraordinary path waiting for her. She was one princess among several, her future already being drawn up by people who'd never ask her opinion. But the circumstances of her arrival remind us that medieval women didn't get to wait for a perfect, private moment. Pregnancy happened mid-journey, mid-negotiation, mid-siege, mid-harvest, mid-pilgrimage, mid-war. Households simply adapted because they had no other option. At the center of that adaptation stood women whose names likely never traveled with the princess into the history books. A professional midwife may have been summoned. An assistant may have supported the mother through the worst of it. Ladies coordinated supplies and messages. Servants kept the household's privacy and order intact. We can't name each of them without a source that confirms it, but the documented presence of trained female practitioners across Iberian communities gives us solid, grounded footing for imagining how this birth was likely managed. A midwife's knowledge, wherever she came from, was cumulative. She'd watched bodies change through pregnancy after pregnancy, seen labor unfold a dozen different ways, learned to read a mother's strength, a child's position, the rhythm of contractions, the condition of a newborn. This wasn't magic, whatever modern stereotypes about women's medicine like to suggest. It also wasn't modern obstetrics. It was practical intelligence, built through repeated exposure and sharpened despite limited tools. Birth was also managed through time, women waiting, watching, encouraging, deciding when more help was needed. Labor's length wasn't measured on a clock the way we measure it now. It was read through the mother's condition and the practitioner's judgment. The waiting alone could exhaust everyone in the room, and the household still had to keep bringing water, warmth, food when possible, and reassurance. Waiting, in other words, was its own kind of work. For Isabella, Catherine's birth added another daughter to a family whose political value was already unmistakable. Catherine would later be promised to Arthur, Prince of Wales, and after his death would marry Henry VIII of England, though none of that future could be seen from inside the birth chamber. In that moment, she was simply a living child whose survival depended on the same ordinary care that follows every birth. Ordinary isn't meant to shrink this. Ordinary care is often exactly what keeps extraordinary history alive. A dynasty survives because infants get fed and kept warm, because mothers recover, because attendants notice illness early, because communities keep passing down knowledge. We remember the crown. The crown rests on countless small acts that never got a monument. Think about how fast a newborn's future can grow bigger than the room she was born into. Catherine's later life makes that almost unbearably clear. She'd become Queen of England, endure enormous political and personal strain, and remain tangled in her parents' dynastic ambitions for the rest of her life. But her beginning wasn't a Tudor courtroom. It was a birth in the world Isabella already knew, a world where the home was the first line of care, and where women's practical labor formed the invisible infrastructure underneath every dynasty in Europe. Delivery ending didn't mean danger ending. The mother still needed watching, rest, food, help with the infant, and close attention to any symptom that could turn serious. A household might celebrate, but celebration never cancelled the physical demands of recovery. She was still vulnerable, and the people around her kept working. The newborn, meanwhile, triggered its own sequence of decisions. Would the mother nurse the child, or a wet nurse? How would the infant stay warm? Who would hold the baby while the mother slept? How would anyone tell ordinary newborn weakness apart from real illness? The answers shifted with class and custom. A royal household might bring in a wet nurse, though we shouldn't assign a specific arrangement to Catherine's birth without a source confirming it. In ordinary homes, breastfeeding and the help of female relatives filled the same role. The Andalusian evidence describes midwives' duties stretching well past the delivery itself, into ongoing newborn and child care. That's part of why a midwife could be valued as a continuing resource for a household, not just someone summoned for a single emergency. She carried knowledge across pregnancy, delivery, recovery, and infancy, and she might be called on again if legal questions came up later. Because birth raised questions of identity that mattered legally. Was the child alive at delivery? Was the pregnancy genuine? Who could speak to what happened if the mother or infant died? In a world where inheritance and status ran through kinship, a midwife's testimony could carry real weight. Her authority was physical and legal at once, intimate and public. This is one of the more revealing threads in the record. A woman could be considered fit to speak about a body precisely because she'd entered a space men were routinely excluded from. Her authority came from access, observation, trust built over years. And that same gendered separation could also lock her out of formal education and political power. Necessary, but not necessarily equal. Christian communities layered in their own rituals around birth and postpartum reintegration. Muslim and Jewish households drew on different legal and religious frameworks. The specifics varied, but a child's birth was rarely just biology anywhere in Iberia. It was naming, kinship, blessing, and a household's renewed connection to its community. The room after birth tended to grow quieter than the room during labor. Attendants lowered their voices. The infant slept. The mother, likely too exhausted to join whatever celebration was starting elsewhere, just rested. This is where a story about queens has to slow down. Isabella would be remembered for armies, faith, and the conquest of Granada, but every one of those public identities was carried by a body that also knew pregnancy, recovery, and loss over and over again. A queen could return to public life, but the timing depended on custom as much as her actual condition. The household kept up appearances while she healed behind the scenes. Messages announced success while the private, physical reality stayed unrecorded. History tends to jump straight from birth to politics, leaving us to carefully infer, never invent, the quieter stretch in between. Historians still argue over the exact details of individual medieval births, and that uncertainty shouldn't be papered over with invented detail. It's better to say plainly that the evidence is incomplete than to furnish a room that never actually existed. What we can say with confidence: childbirth required organized female labor, Iberian midwives held recognized responsibilities, and royal births tied domestic care directly to succession and diplomacy. What does it mean to remember the unnamed women who made the documented lives of queens possible in the first place? It means widening the circle. Isabella stays central because her life is so well documented, but her story keeps opening onto other lives: the parterers, the cabillas, the assistants, wet nurses, servants, sisters, mothers, and neighbors who held up childbirth across every kind of Iberian household. Some were paid, some were kin, some were trained professionals, some simply came because a woman in labor needed them, full stop. Their work was repetitive, but repetition isn't the same as unimportant. If a midwife attended dozens of births, her real success might be that most of them never made it into a chronicle at all. Success, in this line of work, often looked like nothing happening, and nothing happening leaves almost no trace on the page. You can't understand medieval childbirth by splitting the sacred from the practical, as if one belonged to superstition and the other to reason. Families prayed and prepared supplies. They asked for intercession and called a practitioner. They used inherited remedies and watched the mother's physical signs closely. All of it formed one continuous world of care, even if a modern eye wants to sort it into separate boxes. Medical manuals of the period mixed learned discussion with popular remedy, and that blend is itself telling. A text could discuss the body in technical language and still preserve household traditions passed down for generations. A recipe wasn't guaranteed to work, and a prayer wasn't a clinical intervention, but both tell us what people feared, what they hoped for, and what they were willing to try. A woman in labor often needed reassurance as much as instruction. Voices around her helped regulate her fear, and the presence of women who'd already survived childbirth made the unknown feel a little less like free fall. That encouragement wasn't decoration. It was part of the physical environment of labor, part of the actual work of helping someone stay present through pain and exhaustion. For a queen, faith could double as politics too. Isabella became closely tied to Catholic reform and the religious identity of the monarchy, but no medieval woman's private devotional life reduces cleanly to public policy. A prayer whispered in a household could belong to personal fear, family tradition, or communal ritual, and we shouldn't turn every sacred object into a state symbol. The Granada campaign layered another pressure onto Isabella's world. The war began in 1482 and ended with the city's fall on 2 January 1492. Through those years, the monarchy's resources, movements, and priorities were bound to the war effort. Pregnancy and birth didn't happen outside that history, they happened inside it, sometimes in residences shaped by military travel and the demands of running a court on the move. A birth could reassure a dynasty and still deepen a mother's burden at the same time. More children meant more responsibility, more decisions down the line. A queen was expected to display gratitude, strength, fertility, and devotion, while her own exhaustion stayed quietly secondary to what the birth meant for everyone else. Celebration, in other words, can be heavy. The household's response to childbirth involved emotional management as much as physical care, keeping the room calm, handling information carefully, protecting the mother's privacy while still satisfying the people waiting outside. In a royal setting, news of a birth traveled through ceremonies, letters, and official announcements. But that first announcement always came out of a room where someone had just survived something genuinely dangerous. Can you feel the tension in that, wanting rest and silence, while an entire court waits outside for news? The women around the mother became guardians of that threshold. They knew when to let visitors in, when to keep them out, when to speak on her behalf, when to insist she needed more time. Even after their names disappeared from the record, their roles stayed visible in the shape of the event itself. A politically significant birth had to be managed socially, and social management was, overwhelmingly, women's labor. Isabella's family also shows how fragile dynastic planning really was. A birth could be celebrated as a promise, and then illness, accident, another childbirth, or plain political misfortune could rewrite the succession entirely. Her only son and heir, Juan, died in 1497. Her daughter Isabella, Queen of Portugal, died in childbirth in 1498. Her grandson Miguel died in 1500. Each loss reshaped the family's future and reminded the entire court that no arrangement was ever truly secure. These deaths were political events, yes, but they were private griefs first. A mother doesn't lose an heir as a constitutional problem. She loses a child. Her daughter's death in childbirth belongs to the exact history of maternal risk this story has been tracing all along, and it exposes the real limits of status, wealth, and medical attention. Royal resources could improve preparation. They couldn't erase the dangers of reproduction. Reading it in a chronology, Isabella's daughter died in childbirth can sound almost weightless, a single line. But that line holds a body, a household, a family, and a future suddenly broken in half. A royal woman dying in labor wasn't rare enough to be unimaginable, and that's part of what makes the record so hard to sit with. The same process that produced heirs and alliances could just as easily take the women expected to produce them. The danger wasn't distributed evenly, of course. Poorer women had far fewer resources. Elite women could often call on multiple attendants and physicians, but that difference shouldn't be mistaken for royal safety. They were safer in some ways and just as exposed in others. The body never respected heraldry. The losses reshaped Isabella's later years too. Her daughter Joanna became heiress of Castile, and the monarchy's political future shifted toward her and her husband, Philip. Family, mental health, succession, and foreign policy tangled together, as they so often do in dynastic history. The household stopped being a place where children grew toward predetermined roles. It became a place where the plan kept having to be rewritten. A queen's motherhood, then, could be an experience of control and helplessness at once. Isabella could arrange marriages, direct policy, and shape her children's political education, but she couldn't guarantee they'd survive, stay healthy, or accept the roles built for them. Her authority was enormous, and it had a hard ceiling. What does persistence look like for a mother whose plans were built around children? Children who kept being taken from the future she'd imagined. We shouldn't turn her into a symbol so quickly that her grief disappears. Sources love to show rulers through public action, but this sequence of deaths gives us reason to slow down and sit with what she must have carried underneath the official story. The queen who sponsored military campaigns and governed vast territories was also a mother who buried a son, a daughter, and a grandson. Life in the household kept moving after every loss. Servants still had work, messengers still traveled, ceremonies still needed arranging, surviving children still needed attention. It can look almost cruel from a distance, but it's also just one of life's ordinary conditions. People grieved and kept going because the living still needed food, decisions, and care. In the history of childbirth, a death often reads like an ending. For the household, it was a reorganization. A wet nurse might be reassigned, a room might empty out, a child might move to relatives, legal papers might be rewritten. The consequences moved outward from that one bed through the whole household like ripples. Isabella's reputation grew quickly after she died, and the centuries that followed reshaped her into a set of grand images. The Catholic queen, Ferdinand's partner, Columbus's patron, the conqueror of Granada, the mother of a European dynasty. There's real history inside those images, but they can also turn her into a monument instead of a person who lived one pregnancy, one negotiation, one illness, and one loss at a time. She died on 26 November 1504 in Medina del Campo at 53 years old, after decades of rule, travel, family pressure, and religious and military transformation. By then the world around her looked almost nothing like it had at her birth, but the household, right to the end, still worked the same way it always had. Illness and death managed through attendance, prayer, and the difficult, patient work of watching over a vulnerable body. Her children carried her legacy far past her own lifetime. Joanna became Queen of Castile in title. Catherine became Queen of England. Their families' connections shaped European politics for generations after Isabella's death. But their success shouldn't make her motherhood sound like a tidy production line. Her children's lives were unpredictable, and their survival was never something she could safely assume. The women who actually managed these births are remembered very differently. A handful of names survive in legal records and academic studies, most stay anonymous. Their legacy is collective, preserved in vocabulary, custom, scattered texts, and the simple, repeated fact that women kept helping one another through pregnancy and birth, generation after generation. The word partera survives. The category Kabila survives in the historical record. The household survives as the place where real expertise was practiced without ever needing a formal archive to prove it. They were there, simple as that. They were there when a mother needed support, when a family needed testimony, when a newborn needed care, when a household had to decide what happened next. Their presence is often visible only through the rules that define their roles, but a rule implies a role, and a role implies real labor behind it. A legal statement about what a midwife could testify to tells us midwives were present in situations where testimony mattered. A medical discussion of childbirth tells us people actively sought out and passed along knowledge. A payment tells us the work had value someone was willing to pay for. Think about how many lives got pulled back from total historical silence by one surviving word, one account entry, one legal reference. This is why childbirth deserves to be treated as more than a small corner of history. It reveals how a society understood women, knowledge, authority, family, and the line between private and public life. It shows who was trusted to touch a body, who could speak about a birth, who got to learn a trade, who got paid, and whose work was actually remembered afterward. Isabella's life gives us an especially clear path through those questions because her body was surrounded by records, even though those records stay incomplete. We know her birth, marriage, children, major political acts, and death. We don't know the fine details of her labors. That gap shouldn't push us toward invention. It should sharpen the line between a documented life and a fully visible one, because they are not the same thing. By the end of Isabella's life, Iberia's political map had transformed completely. Granada fell in 1492, the monarchy consolidated its power, and overseas expansion was already carrying Castilian ambitions across the Atlantic. But childbirth still happened in rooms where the future arrived unannounced, shapeless. The child born in December 1485 had grown into a princess with a defined place in a changing dynasty. But the basic facts of infancy hadn't changed just because the crown had grown stronger. The birth chamber stayed a place of transition. A woman entered pregnant and left a mother, or sometimes didn't leave at all. An infant entered the world with no status it could possibly understand, and status could be pinned onto it within minutes by everyone else in the room. The chamber held both the most personal vulnerability imaginable and the largest social expectations a family could carry. In ordinary homes, the effects of a birth stayed local. A mother's recovery shaped the household's work, the feeding of other children, the balance of labor among relatives. In elite homes, the effects reached across kingdoms, but the first moments looked almost identical either way. Hands supporting a body, voices encouraging, cloth and water ready, someone watching, someone waiting, someone remembering how earlier births had gone. None of this means every woman's experience was the same. Religion, class, ethnicity, geography, age, and access to trained help all mattered enormously. Christian kingdoms in the north, Muslim communities across Al-Andalus, Jewish households, frontier settlements, cities, royal courts, each had its own way of organizing this work. A history built around Isabella has to keep those differences in view rather than erasing them. The phrase medieval Spanish homes is a modern convenience, not a medieval identity. People across the peninsula spoke Castilian, Catalan, Aragonese, Arabic, Hebrew, Galician Portuguese, Basque, and more, and their laws and customs weren't interchangeable. The best a historian can do is describe patterns carefully, cite the regions and sources behind them, and resist the temptation to let one queen's household stand in for every woman's experience. I want to be honest one more time about where the record runs out. We can't reconstruct the ordinary home in full detail, and we can't treat a later medical text as a word-for-word account of what happened during Isabella's own labor. What we can reconstruct is a network of real possibilities, anchored in evidence. Domestic birth, women's assistance, trained and experienced midwives, learned medical tradition, legal recognition, ritual care, postpartum labor, and the constant undertow of risk. What's left, then, isn't a perfectly furnished scene, It's a truthful atmosphere. A world where care was real even with limited tools, where knowledge could be sophisticated without being modern, where women's work mattered enormously precisely because it happened in the ordinary spaces records tend to overlook. Catherine's birth brings us back to where we began. A queen in labor while a war continued outside, and now we can see why that scene actually matters. It isn't just a dramatic beat in one famous woman's biography. It's the exact meeting point between household and state, between midwifery and monarchy, between the unnamed labor of attendants and the fame that would one day attach itself to a princess. Catherine couldn't know she'd cross the sea one day and become Queen of England, standing at the center of a constitutional and religious crisis. Isabella couldn't know the exact shape of the future her body was delivering into the world, and the women assisting her, documented or lost, couldn't know historians would one day go looking for the practical world surrounding this one child's arrival. A birth always looks bigger in hindsight than it feels in the moment. In the moment, there's only the next breath, the next contraction, the next decision, the next small cry, and the careful work of keeping mother and infant together. Think of how many dynasties, communities, and ordinary families began with that exact same narrow horizon. One room, a few tired women, and the hope that the next breath would come. That hope wasn't always answered. The history of childbirth demands tenderness precisely because it includes loss so often. Isabella's family knew celebration and grief, succession and uncertainty, public triumph and private mourning all tangled together. She's remembered in grand language, but the most human part of her story might be how often it circles back to a limit, to the plain fact that power can't command everything, and that even queens depended on other people's care. The medieval home wasn't outside history. It was one of history's engines. Inside its rooms, women gave birth, practiced medicine, carried memory, raised children, gave legal testimony, and preserved knowledge that formal institutions never bothered to write down. The household could be restrictive and protective at once, unequal and resourceful at once, private and politically important at once. Its contradictions are part of the story, not a flaw in it. So when we think of Isabella of Castile, we can hold the public queen without losing the woman underneath her. We can remember Catherine's difficult later life without forgetting the infant she once was. We can remember the union of two crowns without forgetting the unnamed hands that kept the bodies inside those crowns alive. There's another way to think about childbirth's history, not as a contest between old medicine and new medicine, but as a history of attention. Someone had to notice the mother's changing strength, the infant's movement, the pattern of pain, any sign of bleeding, the passing of time, and the exact moment when reassurance stopped being enough. Attention isn't a cure, but it's the beginning of judgment, and judgment was one of the most valuable tools a medieval household actually had. A midwife's authority grew from knowing how to look. She'd learned that two labors could start out identical and end completely differently, that a quiet woman wasn't automatically a safe one, and that a frightened household could make every sign look worse than it really was. She had to work with the mother's fear, the family's expectations, and the hard limits of what could actually be done. A student watching her wasn't learning a single recipe for birth. She was learning how to read a constantly shifting situation. This kind of knowledge was hard to write down. Written medicine tends to preserve named substances, procedures, and theories, while practical expertise lives in timing, touch, posture, tone of voice, in the ability to make a decision without needing to perform certainty. An experienced practitioner might say very little or repeat familiar phrases no scribe ever thought worth recording. And still, a household could remember her clearly for years. In Al-Andalus, the line between a trained Kabila and an experienced volunteer helper shows us how a community actually distributed this knowledge. Not every helper was a professional. Not every professional worked alone. One woman might lead, another support the mother from behind, another manage the household's other children or gather supplies. The labor of childbirth was specialized and collective at the same time. Christian communities followed a similar pattern, even with different terms and legal structures. The word partera belongs to a much wider European vocabulary for women who assisted birth, and the fact that nearly every language had one tells us this work was socially recognizable, even when the individual women doing it weren't. Names changed. Institutions changed. The practical necessity never did. It must have taken real nerve to walk into a laboring woman's room, knowing everyone hoped you could help, and knowing, too, that the limits of what you knew might become obvious at any moment. Confidence in this setting was never the same thing as certainty. Sometimes it meant keeping the mother calm, sometimes asking the right question, sometimes summoning more help fast, or refusing a dangerous delay, or simply admitting a situation had slipped past what anyone in the room could fix. The best account of this history doesn't turn every midwife into a flawless heroine. It recognizes competence under real pressure, without punishing the past for lacking tools nobody had invented yet. Calling a midwife could itself be an act of planning. Pregnancy might be watched across weeks or months, and a household would already know which practitioner lived nearby. A wealthier home could arrange payment and supplies in advance. A poorer home might rely on relatives and neighbors to do the same labor for free. The line between formal service and mutual aid was real, but the two constantly overlapped. A midwife's presence built a relationship of trust that outlasted the delivery itself. She might know the mother's earlier pregnancies, her general health, and the wider circumstances of the family. Her knowledge was local, and local knowledge carried real power because it connected one birth to a much longer, remembered history. Memory in this world was a kind of medicine, not in the modern pharmacological sense, but as a way of recognizing a pattern, recalling what had happened before, avoiding a mistake experience had already taught. A midwife trained through oral transmission carried a living archive inside her, one she could pass on to another woman through demonstration and repetition, exactly as it had been passed to her. The birthing room was usually treated as a female space, and that separation protected a woman's privacy while also revealing exactly how limited her wider world was. Women could work there, teach there, and hold real authority there, while the political order outside still made every decision about marriage, inheritance, legitimacy, and property. A woman could be central to a birth and completely peripheral to the legal decisions that followed it. But privacy wasn't the same as insignificance. Inside the domestic space, women decided how care was organized, which practitioner to trust, and how information moved. The household was where official authority met practical authority, and the meeting wasn't always smooth. A learned male physician might offer an opinion, a midwife's experience shaped what actually happened in the room. A husband might be legally responsible for the household. Women controlled who had access to the mother. Royal households magnified all of this. Isabella's pregnancies were surrounded by people playing formal and informal roles, public and private ones at once. Her attendants ranged from ladies of high rank to servants handling practical tasks to women whose expertise came from a very specific kind of service. A court had ceremony, but it also had kitchens, laundry, nursing, storage, and the quiet, constant logistics of keeping bodies alive. Even the language of privacy needs care here. A medieval woman wasn't necessarily alone with a tight circle of confidants. Birth could involve many women at once, and a mother's privacy usually meant exclusion from male observation rather than actual solitude. The chamber could be crowded, busy, and intensely intimate, all simultaneously. Privacy was relational, shaped entirely by who was let in and who stayed at the door. What would it mean to face the most vulnerable physical experience of your life, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for you, and also by people who are going to report on exactly what happened? For a queen, the answer got especially complicated. News of a birth mattered enormously to supporters and rivals alike, and a household couldn't keep it private forever. The mother needed seclusion, officials needed confirmation. Her attendants became the bridge between raw physical experience and political information, and their words carried real consequences. In legal settings, a midwife's testimony could help establish whether a child had been born alive, whether a pregnancy had been genuine, or whether some disputed event had truly happened. Her presence at that threshold gave her a kind of authority unusual for women in a patriarchal world. But it didn't free her from regulation, suspicion, or the social hierarchy sitting above her. The history of women's medicine in Iberia holds both recognition and marginalization at once. Midwives were respected and needed, while formal medical institutions could still limit their education or challenge their standing. Later centuries would see fiercer struggles over medical authority, but the seeds of that conflict were already sitting here, in older questions about who got to practice, who got to teach, and whose knowledge counted as legitimate in the first place. Isabella's story doesn't resolve any of that, it just makes it visible. Her body was attended inside a hierarchy that prized learned men and depended, quietly, on women's practical labor. Her children were recorded by name. Most of the people who helped bring them safely into the world were not. That imbalance isn't an accident. It's baked into how archives get built. Medieval rulers moved constantly for diplomacy, ceremony, war, religious observance, and the sheer logistics of governing territory that was large and unevenly connected. A pregnancy or birth could easily happen inside a household that wasn't settled anywhere permanent. The practical machinery of care had to travel too, carried by attendants, servants, supplies, and relationships already established in whatever town the court happened to be passing through. For Isabella and Ferdinand, the Granada campaign made this constant movement unavoidable. The war ran from 1482 until Granada's surrender in 1492, and Isabella's life during those years can't be reduced to a single palace or a single domestic routine. Location, season, the military situation, and the monarchy's needs all shaped the environment where each pregnancy and birth had to be managed. It's tempting to picture travel as an interruption to childbirth, but travel was the structure of medieval life. Women gave birth wherever they happened to be, visiting or living temporarily, and households simply carried their knowledge along with them. A midwife might travel with the court, or local practitioners might be found at each new residence, or the household might lean on both at once. Without a specific record, we shouldn't guess which of these applied to Isabella's own delivery, but we can appreciate exactly why adaptability mattered so much. In ordinary Iberian homes, the seasons mattered just as much. Heat, cold, access to water, food supplies, and distance to the next household all shaped how a birth got managed. Urban women often lived close to practitioners and markets. Rural women leaned more on kin and neighbors. Home covers all of it, from a royal residence to a modest dwelling, and a careful history shouldn't pretend they were interchangeable. The household was porous too. Neighbors crossed thresholds, relatives arrived, practitioners moved between homes, carrying information with them. A woman who assisted one delivery might be called to the next, and a midwife's reputation could travel through exactly these networks. The domestic sphere wasn't cut off from the wider community. It was one of the main ways a community organized care in the first place. A birth could become its own small moment of exchange. The midwife brought knowledge into the household offered payment or hospitality in return. The outcome settled into local memory. At court, the exchange grew more formal and the stakes climbed higher, but the basic principle held: care depended on relationships. Imagine carrying your knowledge from house to house, learning the layout of an unfamiliar room, while the person you'd come to help was already deep in pain. That's where the short distance between competence and improvisation becomes obvious. A practitioner could bring experience with her, but never the architecture, climate, or supplies of the home she walked into. She worked with whatever was there, and the household scrambled to meet her requests. The birth chamber was never a fixed laboratory. It was a temporary arrangement, built fresh around one body at a time. That's why broad descriptions of medieval childbirth have to stay modest. We can describe patterns. We can't promise every woman sat in the same position, used the same furniture, or reached for the same remedy. Some popular retellings borrow picturesque details that actually belong to a different region, century, or class entirely. Keeping those details in their proper place is simply part of doing this honestly. Isabella's royal household had more capacity to build a controlled environment, but it also carried more people, more demands, more scrutiny. Catherine's birth happened inside a family already embedded in a military and dynastic project. The pressure wasn't just to keep mother and child alive. It was to make the birth legible to an entire political world watching from outside the door. After Catherine's birth, the household's work shifted from delivery to formation. A princess wasn't raised by her parents alone. Her education, clothing, religious instruction, physical care, and social training all involved attendants and teachers, and her earliest years were shaped by the same domestic systems that protected infants across Iberia, just at a much larger scale. The infant who needed to be held would grow into a child who needed instruction. The child watched for signs of illness would become a political figure whose marriages got negotiated on her behalf. That shift from body to role happened gradually, and women stayed deeply involved throughout it. Nurses, ladies, servants, tutors, and relatives building the environment a royal child needed to learn how to move through a court. This is another way childbirth threads through history. Bringing a child into the world doesn't end at delivery. It becomes the ongoing labor of keeping that child alive, teaching them, preparing them for a society. In ordinary households, that preparation meant learning work, religion, kinship duties, and local custom. In a royal household, it meant languages, ceremony, dynastic memory, and learning to manage public attention from a very young age. Isabella's own children show how differently these paths could unfold. Juan was groomed as heir. Joanna became central to the succession after everyone else died. Maria entered another royal marriage. Catherine became a figure in English history. None of these later roles were visible in infancy, but the household's labor is exactly what made every one of them possible. A mother's relationship to her child could be affectionate and strategic at once, intimate and political at once. Isabella had to think in terms of marriage alliances, and she also lived through the daily, physical presence of her children. Those two perspectives coexisted without canceling each other out. Medieval parents weren't incapable of love just because inheritance was on the line, and political calculation didn't make physical care any less real. What if the word dynasty included feeding, washing, comforting, and teaching, and not just treaties and succession? The word would feel a lot closer to the ground. Still, a structure of power, sure, but one that clearly depended on bodies and relationships to survive at all. The history of childbirth helps put that dependence back into view. In Al-Andalus and beyond, women's care stretched into childhood illness and newborn needs well past the birth itself. A midwife's work overlapped with female physicians, healers, wet nurses, and household caregivers. Some women had access to more formal training through family connections, others learned purely by doing. The boundaries stayed loose, and a single woman might be known in several different ways depending on who needed her and when. Professionalization, in other words, was gradual and uneven. Words like Kabila, Letawani 6D, a B.I. Macron B, and Partera marked distinct roles on paper, but real practice crossed those lines constantly. A woman might assist a birth, advise on a pregnancy, care for a sick child, and later testify in a legal dispute, all the same woman, recognized by her community even when institutions never granted her equal standing. Surviving medical texts can make learned knowledge look more important than oral knowledge, simply because books leave a bigger trace behind. But a book can't attend a labor on its own. It has to be interpreted, adapted, joined to human judgment in the moment. The real history of childbirth lives in the space between text and touch. There's a trap worth watching for in stories about medieval women. When people discover midwives were genuinely skilled, they sometimes romanticize the past into a lost world of wise women and natural birth. When they discover how dangerous childbirth actually was, they sometimes flip to picturing medieval women as pure victims. Both pictures are too narrow to be true. Women held real agency inside systems that also constrained them. They could choose a practitioner, lean on kin, seek out remedies, read symptoms, negotiate with husbands or officials, and protect each other's privacy. They could also lack resources, face coercion, be shut out of education, and die of things modern medicine now treats easily. Agency and vulnerability were never opposites. They sat together all the time. The same is true of Isabella. She wielded extraordinary political power and still couldn't control every pregnancy, every death, every choice her children made. She wasn't simply a victim of dynastic expectation, and she wasn't free of it either. Her life shows how people act inside structures far bigger than themselves and still manage to act. Complexity in this sense is a form of kindness. It's kinder to the past because it refuses to turn people into caricatures. It's kinder to the women whose work was practical rather than celebrated because it holds their skill and their limits together honestly. And it's kinder to Isabella herself because it lets her be a ruler, a mother, a daughter, a wife, and a person who lived with real uncertainty, all at the same time without contradiction. Imagine being remembered for your decisions, while the hardest physical experiences of your life go almost entirely unrecorded. That's the position a lot of historical women occupy. The archive preserves public identity far more readily than bodily experience. We know Isabella's dates because governments and dynasties needed dates recorded. We don't know the full texture of her labors because nobody at the time considered that worth writing down. That absence shouldn't get filled in with fiction. It should be acknowledged and set beside whatever the record actually can support. We know Isabella bore children. We know Catherine was born in December 1485. We know the family was in the middle of the Granada campaign. We know Iberian societies had professional midwives and female caregivers whose work carried real domestic and legal weight. Those facts are enough to tell a meaningful story without pretending to know every private word spoken in that room. Ordinary women of the period deserve the same care from us. Isabella's household shouldn't stand in for every village and city in Iberia, but royal history isn't unrelated to social history either. A court was still a household, however exceptional, and the same principles of care, reputation, and risk connected it to the wider world outside the palace walls. When a mother and child both survived a birth, the consequences unfolded slowly. Immediate relief turned into a new rhythm of feeding, nursing, sleep, recovery, and supervision. The mother's body needed real time, even while public responsibilities kept pulling at her. The infant's survival reshaped the family's future, and the household reorganized itself around this new life almost immediately. For a royal child, survival meant ceremony and expectation. A name could connect the infant to ancestors, saints, or political hopes. Announcements traveled outward, and the birth got folded into the larger story of the monarchy. But the child still needed the same ordinary care any infant needs, and the household still needed women who understood exactly what that care required. When the mother didn't survive, the consequences ran differently but just as far. The newborn might go to a wet nurse or another female caregiver, and the household had to hold itself together without the woman who'd been at its center. If the infant died instead, the family faced grief, while legal and dynastic consequences followed close behind. A birth's record is never just about the moment of arrival. It's about everything that arrival changes afterward. Isabella's own family lived through both the promise and the fragility of survival. Her children carried her name and influence into later generations, but the deaths of Juan, Isabella, and Miguel reshaped the succession completely. Royal resources helped, but the household still lived inside the same fundamental uncertainty that shaped every family in Iberia, rich or poor. A mother's body could be treated as a political resource, but it was never reducible to one. The pain, the recovery, the risk, none of it was metaphorical. These were physical experiences that shaped the person living through them. Telling Isabella's motherhood honestly means letting that physical reality stay present, even when the political story around it gets loud. That's why a story like this one has to move gently. The subject holds real danger, and it also holds the slow companionship of care women speaking softly, preparing what they could, staying awake through the night, families waiting, not knowing what the next hour would bring. The quiet humility of people who understood that effort still mattered, even when the outcome could never be guaranteed. Sources don't speak with one voice. A medical text classifies the body. A legal record defines what a midwife could testify to. A chronicle celebrates a royal birth. A household account lists payments and supplies. Each document preserves one narrow angle, and a historian has to lay them side by side without pretending they're all the same kind of evidence. The study of Andalusian midwives draws on medical and legal sources together, and it stresses that women's roles were shaped by a genuinely multicultural society. It describes midwives as practitioners trained through apprenticeship, as caregivers working in the domestic sphere, and as participants in legal proceedings, while also naming the patriarchal limits placed on their education and professional standing. That combined picture is more useful than any single dramatic anecdote, because it lets us see the whole system surrounding individual births. Isabella's biography offers a different kind of evidence entirely: dates, political outcomes, family relationships, major transitions, the plain fact that childbirth and dynastic loss ran through her whole life. It doesn't give us a full ethnography of her labor room, and the midwifery research doesn't tell us precisely who attended her. Together, though, the two support a careful narrative. Her documented births can sit inside the broader domestic and professional practices of medieval Iberia, without us needing to invent private details that were never recorded. Evidence has edges, and those edges matter because they protect the people inside the story. Claim too much, and we replace real people with our own imagination. Claim too little, and we just repeat the archive's original neglect. The real work is staying close to what's known, while letting the known facts open naturally onto bigger human questions. So what can we responsibly imagine? We can imagine a mother needed support, because labor always requires support. We can imagine a royal household had to organize its attendance, because no court runs without household labor. We can imagine a newborn needed care, because every infant does. We can talk about midwives using the evidence Iberian medical and legal traditions actually give us. What we can't do is invent a named attendant, a specific spoken prayer, a particular chair, or an exact emotional reaction from Isabella without a source behind it. That restraint doesn't make the story colder. If anything, it makes the quiet details hit harder. An unnamed hand isn't less moving for staying unnamed. A missing room isn't less important for staying undescribed. The uncertainty itself tells us something real about whose experience the archive was ever built to preserve. The distance between Isabella's court and an ordinary household was real, but it wasn't absolute. Wealth bought attendance, space, food, and political protection. Ordinary women carried the practical burden of household labor with far less help available to them. But both settings ran on the same underlying engine: women's work, local knowledge, and the shared understanding that birth was a communal event, even while the mother's body experienced it alone. In an ordinary home, a mother might have other children nearby, relatives on hand, and household work that simply couldn't stop for her labor. Life had to keep functioning while birth happened in the next room. In a royal residence, officials and servants could split up the tasks more formally, but the basic need for organization never went away. Someone had to manage the room, the supplies, the messages, the infant, and the expectations of everyone waiting outside. The real difference was scale and consequence. A village birth affected one family's survival and its labor capacity. A royal birth could affect an entire kingdom's succession. Both mattered enormously. The historian just shouldn't flatten them into the same experience. A partner's reputation among her neighbors mattered to an ordinary family in almost the same way a court physician's reputation mattered to a monarch. Trust grew through stories passed along about previous births, carried through women's own networks. A calm, observant, careful practitioner got sought out again and recommended to others. In that sense, childbirth's history is also a history of community memory. The word home implies people who already knew each other's histories. A midwife might know a woman's mother, her sisters, her earlier pregnancies, her working conditions. She could understand this birth not as an isolated emergency, but as one chapter in a lifetime she'd already been watching unfold. That continuity could make care feel deeply personal, and it could also make privacy that much harder to hold onto. Imagine the comfort and the discomfort of being helped through your most vulnerable moment by someone who already knows your entire family's story. For Isabella, the family story was unusually public. Her children's births counted as matters of succession, traceable through chronicles and biographies for centuries afterward. But even a queen had a body with a history, one her attendants knew far more intimately than the official record ever reveals. Every pregnancy followed the ones before it, and every birth got read in light of what had already happened. The most honest tone here is neither sentimental nor clinical. It's intimate but careful, admiring without inventing. Isabella's strength doesn't require us to pretend she felt no fear. The midwife's skill doesn't require us to pretend they never faced failure. Real historical empathy means letting people stay uncertain, embodied, and unfinished, exactly as they actually were. Catherine's birth in December 1485 became meaningful because of everything that followed. She'd be raised as a Spanish infanta, tied to the royal household of Castile and Aragon, and later sent into the politics of England. Her life would hold marriage, widowhood, succession, religion, and a long, bitter struggle over her marriage to Henry VIII. Those later events tend to overshadow her beginning, but the beginning still matters, precisely because it shows her before the world started making demands of her. The infant at the center of that birth chamber had no public voice at all. Others named her, carried her, fed her, imagined her future for her. That's true of every newborn, but in a royal household, the imagined future got written straight into treaties and diplomatic plans before she could even hold up her own head. Her mother's body was the doorway a political person walked through into the world. Isabella's own future was shaped by childbirth too, through the children she bore and through the losses she endured. Her legacy can't be separated from motherhood, but motherhood shouldn't be treated as the only meaning of her life either. She ruled, negotiated, sponsored, judged, prayed, traveled, and made hard decisions across decades. Childbirth's history adds depth to her story. It doesn't replace her political agency. One life held many rooms: the room of childhood, the room of marriage, the birth chamber, the council room, the chapel, the road, the military camp, the room where news arrived, the room where grief had to be endured. A person could move through all of these without becoming a different person each time. Isabella's public authority and her private vulnerability belonged to the same one life. The unnamed midwives held many rooms too. Their work moved between homes, families, legal proceedings, and bodies. Their knowledge fit no single category, and their legacy sits scattered across the records of medicine, law, religion, and household practice. To remember them is to remember that expertise usually shows up first in the places people actually need it, long before institutions ever claimed to define it. The story started with a December labor and a mystery, a queen at her most vulnerable, a child whose future no one could yet see. We can name them now. The queen was Isabella of Castile, the child was Catherine of Aragon. And we can stay honest about what the evidence does and doesn't reveal, even after naming them. Around this one birth stands a much wider history. Iberian homes, professional midwives, experienced helpers, medical texts, legal testimony, religious practice, and the constant, unglamorous work of caring for bodies. The women who managed childbirth didn't share one method, one religion, one class, or even one vocabulary. Their worlds were genuinely diverse, and their records stay incomplete, but they shared one task that connects generation to generation, helping a woman through the threshold of birth, and helping a newborn find its way into a community. Maybe the most enduring image here isn't the crown or the battlefield. It's the circle of attention around a vulnerable person, a midwife, an assistant, a relative, a servant, a friend, looking closely, listening carefully, doing whatever could be done. That work rarely gets celebrated, and the people standing outside the room may never fully know how much depended on it. What would our histories look like if we measured importance not just by who got named, but by who made survival possible in the first place? We might see that the grand narrative was always propped up by intimate labor underneath it. We might hear the quiet authority of women who learned through experience, taught through practice, and carried real knowledge into homes no chronicler ever bothered to visit. We might come to understand Isabella not only as a queen who reshaped kingdoms, but as a woman whose public life rested entirely on the private care every human life actually requires. The story can rest here, the child sleeping, the household growing quiet, the future still hidden from everyone in the room. Catherine's later life will be full of titles and conflict. Isabella's will be full of decisions and grief. But for one moment, in December 1485, there's only the beginning and the patient care that lets a beginning grow into a life. If tonight's story helped you settle, a like and a subscribe helps more of these slow journeys find you. Tell me which part stayed with you most: the birth chamber, the work of the midwives, Isabella's losses, or Catherine's uncertain beginning. And once more, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Sleep well, my friend. Let the room grow peaceful around you. Thank you for staying with this story tonight. I'll meet you again soon in another quiet corner of history.